All right, welcome back, everyone. You all enjoyed lunch and hope you had some interesting conversations together. Thank you again for being here. My name is Daniel Anderson. Again, I'm the Water Law Fellow at the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at the University of Colorado Law School. I'm honored to be the moderator for this panel. And I spent the past year researching reform in Western water law and policy. And it's good to see so many people here today interested in tribally led water management at Wind River Reservation. So my honor to introduce our panelists. But before I do so, I just wanted to note, our first two panels this morning, led by the Wind River Water Resource Control Board and community organizations from our last panel before lunch, are working here at the Wind River and are really focused more closely on what has been done and what is being done. I think as Dr. Teresa Spoon-Hunter mentioned, are in the trenches as we speak. And so our hope for this panel, this third panel, is really to share thought-provoking research and developments regarding some water management challenges facing tribal nations beyond Wind River, and then what solutions are currently being explored to address those challenges. So the potential solutions that our panelists are going to discuss would undoubtedly take time and continued persistent effort. But we hope that this panel might invite us to consider some of the potential pathways that water management at Wind River could develop. So each panelist will give a short presentation. And I'll try to keep them to 15 minutes, which I know will be hard. And then I'll offer some questions that we prepared to discuss. So for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and we'll save hopefully 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions from you all, including those online. Last thing before I introduce our panelists, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., we have an optional water infrastructure tour. So we're going to be driving around with some of the really knowledgeable folks in the room to visit key water infrastructure at Wind River Reservation. So meeting up at 8 a.m., grabbing some breakfast to go, driving to sites like Bull Lake, proposed steamboat reservoir project location, diversion dam and Wyoming Canal, and then Ray Lake and Washakie Reservoir. So it'll be a busy 4 hours, and hopefully we get to see a lot of the things that we're talking about throughout various presentations today. And then we'll have a sack lunch and debrief back here at the Wise building. So please join us for that if you can. And with that, I want to introduce our panelists. So Jason Robison is a professor of law at the University of Wyoming Law School. His research primarily revolves around water, public lands, and Native peoples in the American West, with a particular emphasis on the complex body of laws and policies governing transboundary relations over the Colorado River system, also known as the Law of the River. He is the editor of the Cornerstone at the Confluence, Navigating the Colorado River Compact's Next Century, a multidisciplinary volume published by the University of Arizona Press for the Historic Compact's 2022 Centennial, and the lead editor of Vision in Place, John Wesley Powell and Reimagining the Colorado River Basin, a multidisciplinary volume published by University of California Press, examining water, public lands, and Native Americans in the basin upon the 1869 Powell Expedition's sesquicentennial. Professor Robison also authors the long-running treatise, Law of Water Rights and Resources. He also serves on the Colorado River Research Group and is a proud member of the Water and Tribes Initiative leadership team. I also want to note that Mr. Robison published a comprehensive law review article on bighorn adjudication back in 2016 as a must-read for anybody interested in learning more about the complex legal history that is the bighorn adjudication. Next, we have Alyson White Eagle. Alyson joined Native American Rights Fund, or NARF, in September 2024 as an inaugural Tribal Water Institute Fellow based in Boulder, Colorado. And as a Tribal Water Institute Fellow, Alyson works on a variety of tribal water issues, some of which she'll share about with us today. Alyson brings a variety of experiences working with both tribal nations and federal agencies. Prior to joining the NARF team, Alyson worked as a research assistant for the Northern Arapaho Business Council, where she provided research and support for testimony before the Wyoming Select Committee on Tribal Affairs on implementing a tuition waiver for Native students at the University of Wyoming. She also interned at the Department of the Interior, Office of the Solicitor, Division of Indian Affairs, and she has also worked with University of Wyoming's Art Museum, where she researched international laws surrounding repatriation. And last but not least, we have Bethany Aragon. Bethany is a retired U.S. Army colonel and a second-year law student at the University of Wyoming's dual degree JD MA program in Environment and Natural Resources. Her military career focused on strategic engagement and complex problem solving in interagency and multinational settings. She's now focused on environmental and natural resource law with a particular interest in tribal water governance. Her current thesis examines treatment as a state status under the Clean Water Act as a potential tool to build tribal capacity and influence water governance outcomes. So thank you all for joining us today and sharing what you've been working on. I really appreciate it. Jason, would you like to begin?
Sure. So I suppose it's my job to pull you out of the food coma. Is that right? Okay, I'll do it. I've got about 20 slides. I wrote myself up about 4 pages of notes, but I'm going to improvise. So if you pull up that first slide, I appreciate it. The first thing I wanted to say is to just express gratitude for the chance to be here. I really appreciate it. This is a magical place for me. And it has been for about a decade, which I know is nothing compared to so many of you in this room. But I have connections to this place and it means something to me. Daniel, thanks so much for everything you've done with organizing. It's been such a pleasure to work with you. Allie and Bethany, oh my goodness, being able to sit on the panel with you, I'm so honored and stoked to be able to do that. My presentation today is going to be basically about interstate water compacts and tribal nations, and how tribal nations and their water rights have been treated historically under interstate water compacts. To make this all real, I'll just say, you're in an interstate water compacted basin right now, the Yellowstone. The wind flows into it, right? Wind flows, it turns into the Bighorn flows into the Yellowstone into Missouri, and not so on, right? So we're in a water compacted basin now. I want to, in the spirit of this being a forum, I want to pose some questions and have a little bit of back and forth rather than just be an academic talking head, all right? So I'll try to weave some of that in addition to the materials I've prepared. Next slide, please. All right. So I have the privilege in Laramie of sitting down and thinking about how relationships among co-sovereigns in North America have looked over big rivers in Western North America, the western part of the continent. The Colorado for sure, the Columbia another, the Rio Grande, the Missouri, etc. What do these co-sovereign relationships look like? So there are 2 articles that I wanted to point you all out to, and I even put my head in the game and created QR codes for them, right? Red or gold badge for me, gold star. If you're interested, check these out. Everything that I'm about to convey over the next 13 minutes or so is blown up considerably in these articles. The first one's probably 50 pages. The second one's 60 or 70. This first article is a research project I got to do that University of Colorado Law Review took an interest in about the Yellowstone River Compact. And again, how the Yellowstone River Compact treats tribal water rights and treats tribal nations. I'm going to weave in material from this article throughout the presentation, but I want you to know that's the full source. And if you want to get after it, please do. Next slide, please. After looking at the Yellowstone River Compact as a case study in interstate water compacts and how they treat tribal nations and tribal water rights, I wanted to blow things up. I wanted to look across the northwestern portion of North America as a whole at all of the water compacts. We have 25 of them, right? I researched with the help of a research assistant Davin Rourke, much appreciated, researched all the interstate water compacts that have been created, applying to the west or adjacent to the west, with the same point of view that I had when I was looking at the Yellowstone River Compact. How are tribal water rights treated? How are tribal nations treated? I wanted to get after it and analyze those things. So I did it. It's a full regional analysis. It's coming out in Yale Law Journal this summer. I've gone through the 4th round of edits on it. So I don't have a hard copy just yet that I can give you, or I would, right? But I got a QR code and I posted it online if anybody wants to take an interest. This is a full regional analysis, right? So again, the reason I'm throwing those up there is to let you know that's the real deal. Those sources will provide a full sense of the content I'm going to try to present in condensed form over the next 11 minutes now or so. All right, next slide, please. Right. What do you see with that amazing map? I loved it. I love the colors they chose. It just grabbed me when I was putting together this presentation. What do you see? You see Turtle Island, right? You see the continent. What else do you see in that? How would you describe it? For me, if you're going to be silent because of your food coma or otherwise, emotional vulnerability issues, I get it. It's kind of like arteries, right? It's for me kind of like a circulatory system. Both my folks work in the medical profession, so maybe that's family of origin stuff, but kind of like the circulatory system of a body almost, right? These veins flowing through different colors to signify how much flows, but we see them across the continent and we can see the darker shaded ones and recognize them as the rivers alluded to earlier, like the Colorado, like the Yellowstone or the Missouri, Mississippi, etc. Next slide, please. But what do you get here? How is this map different than the first? What's superimposed on those arteries or those veins? The lines of a settler state, the geopolitical lines that have been constructed over the past few centuries for political and social organization across Turtle Island, superimposed on the landscape, and the rivers think it's all a big damn joke because they don't care about those lines. They just keep flowing, right? So you have a disjuncture, you might say, between the lines that the rivers carve across the continent and the lines that are superimposed on that continent again for political organization, the geopolitical lines. We have transboundary rivers as a result of that disjuncture between the lines that the rivers carve and the geopolitical lines we put on this part of the continent as a species. We have transboundary rivers and you know them, and again, we're in a transboundary river basin now. So, what to make of these transboundary rivers? Who should have a say in how these transboundary rivers are managed, and who should be pushed to the margins and not included? Whose water rights along these transboundary rivers matter, and whose, again, can be pushed to the margins and don't matter? These questions are what drove my research. These maps are what have driven my research. Next slide, please. All right. The primary way under the US Constitution that we deal with relationships over big rivers like the Missouri or the Colorado, et cetera, is interstate water compacts. That method can be traced to 1787 and the compact clause of the Constitution here. Short and sweet, just basically says states, you can form compacts about stuff as long as we, Congress, consent to it. There's more nuance there, but that's the takeaway. Left hand of the side of the slide. Same slide, please. No problem. Chronologically, if you look how many times the compact clause has been invoked, that's a fireworks show going on, right? We're looking at about 25 times in the history of the United States as a settler state, we've had compacts adopted to deal with co-sovereign relations over big transboundary rivers in Western North America, and there's a couple in the Northeast, but almost all in Western North America. Question back for all of you. Which sovereigns had a voice in shaping these transboundary water instruments? Who had a say? You can see from the compact clause. Who had a say? States, for sure. And who gets to say thumbs up or thumbs down? The feds, right? The trustee, as we'll learn about more. The US Congress. Who had no voice in the matter, despite the fact that their sovereignty predates the settler state itself. Despite the fact that their sovereignty goes back millennia for time immemorial, and their governance structures constitute the first forms of governance structures on the North American continent, tribal nations. No voice whatsoever in these deals. founded 25 times under the compact clause. Next slide, please. To be clear, these compacted basins include tribal lands. This thing looks like an Easter egg, right? I love the colors. This is, thanks to Davin Rourke again, now in southern Colorado doing work. This is an effort spatially to show you where these interstate water compacts got created, the basins they got created for. All the colored ones, they're compacted. Look at the state of Colorado. Look at the state of Wyoming from this perspective. Heavily compacted. Lots of need, you might say, high necessity to figure out what co-sovereign relations are going to look like over these rivers that give no regard to the geopolitical lines. You've got to figure out those relationships, and that's what we've done. So this accounts for all of the existing Western water compacts in and adjacent to Western North America. The table, the way it adds value, I know that the text is too small. You'll have to be able to access the slides on your own if you wish. They identify the different tribal lands and areas within the compacted basins. There are some compacted basins where the number of tribal lands and areas is pretty modest. There are others, though, where it's considerable. Think about the Colorado River Basin. 29 reservations, 30 tribal nations, 11 off-reservation trust lands. Rio Grande Basin, you've got 23 reservations, 12 off-reservation trust lands. So there's variability in the relative presence of tribal lands and areas across these compacted basins, but in no uncertain terms, there's 17 of them, these compacts that apply to basins with tribal lands and areas. Next slide, please. All right. Question then becomes, when these things were designed, how'd they treat tribal nations and how'd they treat tribal water rights? And that's the reason that I have this picture of the Milk River with a young native girl on it. Throughout the entire period that the interstate water compacts were being formed in U.S. history, something called the Winters Doctrine existed, announced by the United States Supreme Court in 1908 for the basic proposition that tribes as sovereigns have water rights under federal law. We're on a reservation where the tribes have a water right under federal law. Reserved rights, Indian reserved rights, founded in the Winters case. The compacts themselves were brought into being from the 1920s through 1984, 60 years. And over that 60-year period, the Winters Doctrine existed. It existed as good law. The folks engaged in the negotiations over the compacts knew about Winters. The folks ratifying compacts back into DC knew about Winters. So again, it tees up the question, well, what'd you do about it? How did you respect tribal water rights in how the compacts were designed? How did you respect tribal nations and how the administrative bodies for the compacts were designed? All right, now to the left-hand side of the slide. As far as tribal water rights, we don't have specific enumerated tribal water rights in the interstate water compacts, not even close. It's as though the Winters rights were an afterthought when the compacts were brought into being. Specifically, we have examples in the compacts of disclaimers that look a couple different ways. One species, nothing in this compact is intended to adversely affect the obligations of the United States to tribes, right? There's a specific tribal reference. General disclaimers, nothing in this compact is intended to adversely affect the rights of the United States, its agents or instrumentalities. No reference to tribal nations, but maybe they get in there somehow textually because they're an agent or instrumentality of the United States. I don't know. I'll never apologize for it. But the point is, this is how the compacts were built, and one way in which you can see tribal water rights were put to the margins. We're an afterthought. We're not prioritized in how the documents were written up. Second category, accounting provisions. We have in the compacts, if you look closely, some provisions that say, hey, water use under a tribal water right, this is in one instance, is going to be counted against the apportionment of the state in which that water use occurs. It's going to be debited against the budget of that state, right? Because that's where the reservation is. We have one instance of that more often, and this might get your goat. We have general accounting provisions that will say something like, yeah, water rights by the wards of the United States, ethnocentric, pejorative term that traces back to the U.S. Supreme Court's Cherokee Nation decision in 1831, right? That water use will be counted against the water use of the state. In both instances, though, whether we're talking about disclaimers in these compacts or the accounting provisions, you don't have tribal water rights placed in their proper status, in their proper position as water rights held by sovereigns, tribal nations. Next slide, please. And if that's not unsettling, right, I hope that what I'm about to present to you will be in the kindest way, like coming from the best place, right? So what about the administrative bodies that are responsible for ensuring that compacts are implemented? It's one thing to write something up on paper, whether it's a treaty or interstate water compact. It's another to implement that thing on the ground. So what about these interstate water compacts in terms of the bodies that are supposed to administer them and ensure that they're implemented? A few things to note here. They're designed differently. This is the typology section, but the general pattern for those 17 compacts that apply to basins with tribal lands and areas, 11 of them have compact commissions. The basin we're sitting in here today is one of those, the Yellowstone River Basin. More on that in a minute. So most of the compacts build compact commissions. That begs the question, who has a voice on those compact commissions? Who has a seat at the table, who does not? Take a look for yourself. In terms of how they're currently built, every single Western Water Apportionment Compact, all 17 that apply to basins with tribal lands and areas, have state representation across the board. In some instances, one state rep, in other instances, more than one. Second category, as far as the feds go, there is federal representation of some sort on every commission, but it's qualified. At most, there's one federal representative. The federal representative in most instances does not have voting power if there's a disagreement on a management issue. In the instances where the representative does have voting power, it's often tied, qualified, in other words, limited to certain subjects and not full voting power. That's the states and the feds. More to the point for my presentation, right now in 2026, there is not an interstate water compact commission with the tribal nation represented on it. Maybe the notion was you rely on your trustee for that, the federal representative. But if you're willing to trust the trustee for something like that, I got a silver mine in Nevada I want to sell you some stock in. As far as the significance of this, why do we care that tribal nations do have no representation on compact commissions at this point in time? Well, those compact commissions do some important stuff. Some of their tasks are technical in nature in ensuring that flow levels and consumptive use levels are accurately tracked, as those bear on water budgets and the availability of water to fulfill tribal water rights. Other things that the commissions do, other tasks, they ensure compact compliance, make sure the terms of the deal are being honored, or if they're being dishonored, do something about it. In a related vein, really important in my view, they provide a venue for dispute resolution. If you have disagreements about water management along one of these big transboundary rivers, like the Colorado, Rio Grande, Missouri, etc., these provide a space where the co-sovereigns can get together and try to work out their differences without going to court, try to talk things out and putting their big people pants on in the process of doing so. So there are many important functions that these compact commissions serve. But the bottom line is tribal nations don't have a single representative on any existing compact commission. Next slide, please. I want to illustrate this by bringing it home. This is the Yellowstone River Basin on the right-hand side of the slide. I know that's a busy map, I know, okay? But it's a good map. One reason I like it is it identifies within this basin, including where we're standing right now, there are 4 tribal nations, 4 tribal sovereigns, Eastern Shoshone, Northern Arapaho, Crow, and Northern Cheyenne. We have an interstate water compact that controls the allocation and the management of the Yellowstone River's flows. Not just the main stem of the Yellowstone, that beautiful body of water that comes out of the Absarokas, but the tributaries that flow into it, including the Wind Bighorn, Clark Fork, etc., Tongue, right? How does this compact illustrate the marginalization of tribal water rights and the non-inclusion of tribal nations that I've been talking about out in the ether from a regional perspective? Let's go there. Next slide, please. The Yellowstone River Compact in Article 6 has about this much to say about tribal water rights. Nothing contained in this compact shall be so construed or interpreted as to affect adversely any rights to the use of waters of the Yellowstone River and its tributaries owned by or for Indians, Indian tribes, and their reservations. So what's that mean in terms of climate change's impacts on headwaters areas and low flows and the relative status of tribal water rights when there's not enough water to go around because of those climate change induced water shortages? Inquiring minds want to know. We don't have that clarity. In contrast, although I didn't throw it on a slide, I'll mention it verbally, Article 5 of the Yellowstone River Compact shows a hell of a lot of effort to map out what the state apportionments would look like under the compact. Article 5, for anyone who's interested in looking at it, it's about a page long. And it uses time, 1950 as a specific date, to create a hierarchy among different types of water rights that can be applied if there's not enough flows to go around. How do Article 5 and Article 6 interface? What's the status of the tribal water rights in light of that text? Next slide, please. I'm an academic and I can pose that question in Laramie, and it's a privilege to do so. But if you don't want to take my word for it, take a look at what the US Supreme Court acknowledged in the Montana versus Wyoming litigation over the Yellowstone River Compact. This text illustrates how the Northern Cheyenne tribe in that litigation, which went from 2007 to 2018, the tribe itself said, we have some questions and some views on the relative status of our winters rights under this compact. Understandably, the US Supreme Court, specifically the special master, Buzz Thompson, and eventually the Supreme Court, didn't weigh in on that issue. They had to resolve some other issues between the states that had to do with state relations. So I get that. The point is, this litigation is an illustration that the relationship between Article 5 and Article 6 of the Yellowstone River Compact is not clear. The status of the tribe's winter rights in the Yellowstone River Basin under this compact is not clear. Next slide, please. And again, I'm like a broken record. If that tribal water rights material doesn't get you kind of worked up a little bit, let's look at the Yellowstone River Compact's administrative body. That's the Yellowstone River Compact Commission mapped out in Article 3. Take a minute, look at the highlighted text. It'll only take you 5 seconds, really. 2 state representatives, Montana and Wyoming. Understandable. 1 federal representative, but appointed by the USGS, director of the USGS, and with qualified voting power. Is there a tribal representative on the Yellowstone River Compact Commission? No. 0. Even though, to reiterate, I could flip back the map, I won't ask for it. We got 4 tribal nations that exist within the basin. Are they relegated to their trustees' representation through the USGS director appointed official? You trust that? Or should tribal nations be deserving of, should it be warranted that they have their own direct representative when it comes to these transboundary river relationships? I, of course, am biased and completely believe the latter. But there it is, the proof's in the pudding. If the stuff I was saying at the regional level didn't make sense. Next slide, please. I'll be wrapping it up. Okay. There are basins within North America right now, Western North America, where tribes are speaking up about this historical marginalization of tribal water rights and historical non-inclusion of tribal sovereigns in transboundary water management. Here's the Colorado River Basin. Right now in the Colorado River Basin, you kind of have to be an ostrich, have your head in the sand, not to realize there are some major things going on because of climate change's impacts on the hydrology of that basin. Wes alluded to that this morning in talking about his travels down to New Mexico. Reservoir operating rules are being ironed out right now for Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 largest reservoirs by storage capacity in the United States. That's being negotiated right now. Tribes are saying, I'll paraphrase this excerpt here, we want a seat at the table. We want a chance to influence what these operating rules look like in this massive river basin with 30 tribal nations and 29 reservations. We want specifically, reclamation should build off positive progress, such as the federal tribe states group, and develop a governance structure that formally and permanently includes basin tribes as governmental partners in the implementation of the post-2026 guidelines and other policy and governance discussions concerning management of the Colorado River. They're stepping up and saying, we're co-sovereigns too. Next slide, please. Maybe even more pronounced. I know there are connections, relational connections, familiar connections between folks on Wind River often and Uinta Ouray, right? I grew up in Salt Lake. So in the Upper Colorado River Basin, we have a commission, an Upper Colorado River Commission, a UCRC. Since at least 2018, the 6 tribes in the Upper Colorado River Basin have been pushing for a seat at that table. They want formal representation on that compact commission. They haven't been able to get it. The most they've gotten, and this is significant, I want to give credit where credit's due, most they've gotten is a memorandum of understanding from 2 years ago that said the Upper Colorado Commission will engage in consultations at least every 2 months to quote, collaborate and exchange information relevant to the Upper Colorado Basin and to discuss potential collaborative action on interstate issues of mutual interest to the UCRC and the Upper Basin tribes. That's not formal representation on the Upper Colorado Commission. No, it's not. Maybe it's an incremental step in that direction. I don't know. I'd love to have an Upper Basin tribal rep here to speak to that question. Next slide, please. Last basin I'll reference, Rio Grande. You have 6 pueblos along the Rio Grande. They're identified on the slide. They've been pushing for the same thing with the Rio Grande Compact Commission, saying 2 things if you follow the media accounts since 2022. We want a voice on the commission, direct representation rather than representation through the BIA, and we want direct communication with the commission rather than having our voice channeled through our trustee, again, i.e. the BIA. So there are 6 Rio Grande Pueblos who are pushing this in the same direction for direct representation in transboundary water management in the midst of really severe impacts of climate change on the hydrology in that basin as well, just like the Colorado Basin. Next slide, please. So, apologies for the heavy text, but this goes back to the regional article I mentioned earlier. I'm just one guy. This is just my personal view, but I think it's totally inequitable and betrays the concept of tribal sovereignty and the federal tribal trust relationship for tribal nations not to have representation on compact commissions. I'm advocating for that just as one man. I believe that's the right direction. I believe tribal sovereignty, the trust relationship, and procedural equity all support that idea. How we implement it is another matter, and I have thoughts on that. I've written them out. I won't bore you with them here now. I know the food coming thing's going on, so I got that. But next slide, please. My final slide. What I'm really suggesting is that there needs to be consideration given in this basin and elsewhere across the West where we've got these big interstate water compacts on the indigenization of compact commissions. The historical exclusion of tribes from these commissions and the notion that the commissions need to be reformed so that there is inclusion of tribal nations alongside the federal and state co-sovereigns. Thanks for hearing me out.
Like Chimawave, is it okay to ask a question?
I've got time for questions at the end of each, if you don't mind. Thank you. All right, just want to make sure we've got enough time. Alyson.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Alyson White Eagle. I'm Northern Arapaho. I am a Tribal Water Legal Fellow at the Native American Rights Fund under the newly created Tribal Water Institute. And there I've had the opportunity and the honor of working with tribes directly on a variety of their tribal water issues. And so today I'll be talking about, the federal trust responsibility and how that relates to water infrastructure within tribal communities. And I'll just make a note that Professor Robison may have pulled you out of the food coma, but I might put you right back in. So I'll start with, the federal trust responsibility and the legal foundation for that. And so it has been mentioned throughout this, throughout the day, the trust responsibility that the federal government has to tribes. And I think sometimes there's not a great understanding of what that means, what that's based on, and what that entails. And so the federal trust responsibility is a legally binding obligation of the U.S. government to protect tribal treaty rights, lands, and resources. And it's rooted in several different legal precedents. So the Supreme Court precedents, Professor Robison mentioned a case earlier, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, where the court characterizes tribes as domestic dependent nations. And so essentially placing themselves in a relationship, similar to, I think the phrase was a ward to his guardian. So basically the trustee. And then there's a set of cases called the Marshall Trilogy. That was one of them. Johnson v. McIntosh, which, established that tribes have a right to occupy the land. The federal government holds that in fee title. And then Worcester v. Georgia, which affirmed that tribal nations are distinct political communities. And so that goes back to what Professor Robison stated earlier. You know, we are and have been sovereign nations since before the United States. Each tribe is different in the things that they believe in. Each tribe is different in how they view the world. And so we all have these distinct government relationships with each other, with ourselves, which has been maintained for years and thousands of years. And so I would just like to point out that, you know, the federal trust responsibility isn't like a gift from the federal government. You know, it's a government to government relationship that the federal government must uphold. And that also has ties to treaties. So you look at the treaty era, and a lot of tribes were giving up vast amounts of land in exchange for promises such as education, healthcare, protection of tribal citizens. And then you go on into, you know, legislation, further legislation. And this is important in the context of water because every federal agency must honor this responsibility and therefore recognize that tribes have the right to manage resources according to their own values and interests. And again, that goes back to each tribe is not, you know, tribes aren't a monolith. We all have our own belief systems. And this responsibility is extremely important in the water context because especially when it comes to the need of water infrastructure within tribal communities, there are a lot of disparities between tribal communities and infrastructure and what that means. So, for example, a huge example of this is the lack of access to clean water that tribal communities face. So here are some statistics that I've found from an organization, the Universal Access to Clean Water Initiative, that I work closely with at NARF. And so one of the statistics that they found were that 48% of tribal homes lack access to reliable drinking water or adequate sanitation. So let's divide this room in half. Half of you don't have access to water, clean drinking water. Like, in what world is that okay, you know? Furthermore, Native households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. Like, you just can't even, you have no running water, you know? And so this disparity leads to further disparities. It's just like one on top of the other. And you look at the public health impacts of these disparities. And you look at going back to the COVID-19 pandemic, and you see that impacted Native populations by COVID was at a rate of 3.5 times higher than the white population. And that was only exacerbated by the inability to practice basic sanitation. There's studies that show that a lack of access to clean drinking water also contributes to chronic illness and diminished community well-being within tribal communities. And so you see the need for infrastructure, you know, because water infrastructure is basically turning that paper water right into wet water. How are we delivering that right that's on the paper to these communities, to our communities? We have these vast amount of water rights, but we don't have the funding to provide that water to our communities. And this is important because it goes beyond health. Infrastructure supports economic security. You know, our tribal ranchers, our tribal farmers, they rely on well-maintained irrigation systems. Our cultural and ceremonial ties to who we are as people, tribal people, Northern Arapaho people, Eastern Shoshone people, we rely on that water to support our way of life. And that is, to me, as a tribal member, extremely important. Who am I if I'm not Arapaho? And who am I if I cannot have access to these types of things? And so it's also, you look to, like I said earlier, you know, legislation. And there have been some legislative wins. And so in particular, the bipartisan infrastructure law earmarked over about $13 billion for tribal communities, which would focus then on clean water and settlement completions, tribal water settlement completions. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides around $720 million for climate resilience and water sustainability, particularly in this area, in the western area. And then one other avenue that tribes go through to get funding for these infrastructure are water settlements. And so when you're legally quantifying your water rights, there's different routes which you can take that, either adjudication, which is litigation, which a lot of tribes try to avoid, and then settlements. And in exchange for giving up a certain amount of their water rights, tribes then are receiving funding for these extremely important infrastructure projects. And so there are challenges that come along with that funding though. There are funding gaps. And so a lot of times these agencies, BOR, IHS, EPA, they are funding these projects, the construction of the projects, but they are not funding the maintenance, the operation and maintenance costs. And so that leaves the tribes left, they're left to fund the salaries of employees, the repairs and electricity of these projects on their own. And a lot of tribes are unable to do that adequately. And one of the things that that comes up often is that proposing that tribal members become rate paying customers, right? So paying for the water that comes into our homes and the water that we use. However, tribes oftentimes face a lot of socioeconomic barriers. And so we're living in essentially poverty, so paying for something that is a right is crazy, and oftentimes even when they are paying, it's not enough to cover those costs anyway. And then another hurdle that tribes have to get over is the bureaucratic hurdle. Each agency has different rules that you have to abide by, different applications. And this can become overwhelming, especially for small tribal communities. Who's going to handle it? Who has the expertise on handling this? And what does this mean? And then another issue that I have come to see within my work is just within these agencies, a lack of understanding of what the federal trust responsibility is. What does that mean as a federal agent? I'm a BOR agent. I am an EPA agent. What is the federal trust responsibility? What does that mean? That's not how it works, but it is in fact how it works. So there are significant challenges when it comes to that. And one of the really cool things about the Tribal Water Institute at NARF is that was the goal of this institute, was to provide capacity to tribes, to train us as young attorneys to get this experience in water law, and go back to tribal communities and assist them in the things that they need. And one of the things that I have found as a legal fellow is this huge need. I mean, we are busy. We are busy, busy, busy. And there's a line. And it's crazy because we should have access to these resources. And so that's the really cool thing about the program that I'm under, is that they're building that capacity. So hopefully we can go out into the world and help tribes do what they need to do when it comes to their water. I also wanted to focus on a success story, right? How has this federal trust responsibility been implemented in a successful way? And so I was looking at the Navajo-Utah settlement, where they secured 81,500 acre feet of water annually with the administrative authority to manage it. And so through that act, they were able to establish tribal utility training programs to ensure local technicians can maintain the system. So a lot of these tribes, a lot of these communities are hauling water. It goes back to the lack of access to water. These communities are driving miles and miles and miles of water every day, every other day, every week. That it gets expensive. You got to pay for the gas. You got to pay for the help. You got to do all of this. And so, through that settlement, they've been able to kind of put a little dent in that burden. And how this relates to Wind River, how can this broader issue relate back to Wind River? While I know that the Wind River irrigation project, it's old, it's suffering from, it needs maintenance. there's a backlog of like, it's, what is it, like 100-year-old infrastructure? Things need to be replaced. All of this, where does this funding come from? How do we get this funding in place? Which bureaucratic process do we have to go through? It's this larger systemic issue within an Indian country. Each tribe you're seeing them have these issues when it comes to their O&M costs and their trainings. So yeah, and so I just want to end my section just by saying, reiterating that well-maintained water infrastructure is the backbone of tribal health. That's what I believe. It's the backbone of our culture and our economic sovereignty. Water is life. It fuels us. It's what drives us every day. And to fulfill that trust responsibility, the U.S., these governmental agencies, should be trained in what the federal trust responsibility is and how to honor it, and then should honor it. And that is all I have.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Bethany Aragon. I'm sure from the introductions Daniel did, you can tell one of these kids is not like the others. And they did not save the best for last. So, but I do want to say, last year, well, not quite a year ago, I was in this very room. I was here for Dr. Spoon-Hunter's field course that she talked about earlier, resource management on Western reservations. And while I was here in this room, I got to hear directly from Richard Valdez about the situation on the Wind River and the in-stream flow conditions. And then we actually got to go out and I got to see it firsthand. And so for me, that put me on a path to wanting to discover if there is a way that the law could be used, a different pathway to try to address those conditions. And so last summer, as I was doing research for the paper we had to write for Dr. Spoon-Hunter's course, I discovered the Wallapai tribe and their use of the Clean Water Act, particularly treatment as a state under water quality standards, to establish an in-stream flow and to build capacity and regulatory authority over their water resources. So that's an approach that's now the focus of my master's thesis. In fact, I'm briefing my thesis proposal next week to Professor Robison and then Dr. Spoon-Hunter and Dr. Page. So they're getting a preview of it here a little bit. But it is going to be the focus of my thesis over the next year. And I'd like to share the Wallapai story with you. And hopefully, after getting you fired up, maybe leave you with a little hope. So the Wallapai tribe, for those of you that don't know, is one of the 11 tribes with traditional connections to the Grand Canyon. The reservation's about 1 million acres, and 108 miles of it are along the Colorado River's, the reservation's northern boundary. And for the Wallapai, much like you all have been describing all day today, the river is not just a resource. Water is not just a resource to them. It's foundational to their identity. It's actually part of their creation story. And they believe that they were created from the reeds, sediment, and clay of the Colorado River. And they've described it as the backbone of their people. It's a life-giving source that connects past, present, and future. But like many tribes, their history with water is marked with exclusion and struggle. From being forced to pay the railroad for the use of water on their reservation, for decades of litigation over the land and water rights on their reservation at Peach Springs, which is their capital, and then to being excluded from the Colorado River Compact. It's against that backdrop that I discovered they started using a different path rather than litigation and some of the more traditional means of advocating for water rights. So following the 1987 congressional amendments to the Clean Water Act that added treatment as a state, the Wallapai began using it to build capacity, not through litigation, but through the federal environmental law. So in 1991, the tribe began developing a water pollution control program using the Clean Water Act funds and a grant and treatment as a state. And then that allowed them to start to build capacity. So they started doing regular water quality sampling. They established a baseline of understanding of all the water sources on their reservation. And then by the mid-1990s, they actually completed formal water quality assessments. And by the late 90s, they were implementing restoration projects and addressing pollution and restoring riparian habitat. Then in 2000, so now a decade later, basically, they codified their water quality standards into tribal law. That included an in-stream flow because water quality is tied to water quantity. In 2004, so 4 years after they implemented the water quality standards into their tribal law and had the capacity and the institutional governance to be able to monitor and control it on the reservation, they applied to the EPA for treatment as a state under water quality standards. And so kind of unique, they actually got approved for those in July of 2004. And then the EPA turned around and approved their water quality standards. You first have to get treatment as a state, be eligible for that, then you get your water quality standards approved. Theirs was a couple months turnaround. By September, they had the EPA approve those. So like I said, when the EPA approved it also, it included provisions for the minimum in-stream flow. From there, they continued to develop their program. Wetlands restoration program, a drought planning program. They kept getting access to federal funding. They were building the relationship with the EPA, building capacity over time. So in that sense, that treatment as a state wasn't just a regulatory designation for them. It really became a foundation for their governance development and for their sovereign control over their water resources. Then in 2022, Congress enacted the Wallapai Water Rights Settlement Act, and they secured long-term water rights. And I should say also, as important as the Colorado River is to them, they actually didn't have access. They had no rights to any of the water in the Colorado River. So this settlement act did give them rights to that water. And then it also included funding and infrastructure build out. So the Wallapai story from exclusion to struggle, or exclusion and struggle to recognized authority and capacity, it raises an important question for me. That is whether early development of that regulatory control over their water resources that enabled them to build the capacity and the governance and the credibility as a tribe to manage their water helped shape the conditions under which that settlement was later achieved. So you can go to the next slide. So it's been discussed a little bit. I think that the traditional tools, litigation and adjudication are important, but they're often slow, expensive, and they don't actually translate often to desirable outcomes. The Bighorn adjudication highlights that. As we've discussed, all day so far, the tribes have the largest, most senior surface water right in the state, but the court stripped it of really any functional utility beyond agriculture, municipal, industrial uses. So alternatively, negotiated settlements are generally accepted now as a preferred path, but they require political will. Since the Bighorn adjudication quantified all the rights in the system and confirmed exclusive state control here in Wyoming, I think it's unlikely that the state will have incentive to want to negotiate with the tribes to address or to co-manage or to do anything about the chronic dewatering of the Wind River. Next slide. So I see treatment as a state as a potential alternative path under the Clean Water Act for water quality standards. Once approved, tribal governments can adopt or strengthen the EPA's baseline national standards. That's been discussed earlier today. And then they can be tailored for what the tribe's priorities are and, the conditions on the reservation. As the Wallapai tribe, or as the Wallapai story shows, treatment as a state is substantive. It's not just designation. You can use it to develop and enforce water quality standards, issue permits, monitor compliance, build capacity, implement programs that are tailored to the ecological and cultural priorities of the tribes. It's essentially sovereignty in action. It enables tribes to govern through action, actually regulating, enforcing, and shaping environmental outcomes on the reservation and off the reservation. No, next slide. So what it takes to quantify, and I know that the tribes have some experience with treatment as a state under the Clean Air Act.
Yeah.
So this is a different act, but, and I'll talk a little more about, it's not easy at all, and it takes a long time. But to obtain treatment as a state for water quality standards, tribes have to meet under Section 518 of the Clean Water Act. They have to establish federal recognition, show that they have a governing body that's capable of exercising authority, show that they have the actual capability to administer the program, to do the water quality assessments, et cetera, and enforce them, and then that they have jurisdiction over the water. And I think the jurisdiction part was what was debated or what was adjudicated during the Clean Air Act. But so hopefully maybe that hurdle is overcome already. But the application is fairly extensive. There are going to be, in analysis over legal and jurisdictional descriptions of the water resources, and then actually what the water quality standards are, which again, in-stream flow can be a water quality standard, because if the quantity is too low, then the quality will suffer. And once those standards are federally recognized, then they are enforceable on the reservation and off. Next slide. So treatment as a state is active. I know we've talked a little about the Trump administration, and you can look at the numbers. 85 tribes have been found eligible to administer water quality standards as under treatment as a state. The most recent was the Yurok tribe in California, and that was in July of last year. And then of those 85, only 53 have their water quality standards approved and adopted by the EPA. And for some, I said it was a quick turnaround, a matter of months for the Wallapai tribe. It takes years for some of the other tribes, and some haven't gotten their standards approved yet, obviously. But the most recent was January of this year. The Morongo Band of Mission Indians in California had their water quality standards adopted by the EPA. So, and once the EPA approves those water quality standards, tribes will also be authorized to administer Clean Water Act Section 401 certifications. So this means the ability to review and certify federally permitted activities that could affect the water quality standards. And so those activities have to comply with the tribe's water quality standards. Next. So I just want to close by saying that this is very much the beginning of my research into this topic. Over the next year, my thesis is going to explore how treatment as a state under the Clean Water Act can function as a strategic tool across multiple stages of water governance efforts, whether as an early step before negotiations to start to build leverage and capacity to, or as a parallel mechanism influencing ongoing disputes, or most importantly, I think for the tribes here, a potential pathway to change the status quo once litigation, adjudication have already produced less than beneficial outcomes. My goal is to better understand how the framework operates really in practice, what it takes actually to get qualified for it, whether it can help shape and really do something about the low in-stream flows here on the Wind River. And I think also just one last takeaway, all of these things take decades. We know Bighorn adjudication was what, 37 years. So the way I see it is that if tribes are going to be spending decades navigating these processes, treatment as a state might offer a way to make those decades more productive, so that it's enabling tribes to have regulatory authority, to build that capacity and to build that influence and that negotiating leverage. And so that's ultimately where I see its strategic value could be applied. Thank you. Oh, and there are all my preferences.
I just have a couple questions.
Thank you, Bethany. Yeah, thank
Number
you.
one is jurisdiction over water. Nobody owns water. You only have a right to water. And so how do you establish jurisdiction over water and not the water right? Seems like that's impossible to establish jurisdiction over water and nobody owns it. So I don't know if that's discern that distinction. I guess that's a requirement, you have to show jurisdiction over water. How do you do that?
That is something that I don't have the answer to right now. I know from the previous attempt or the previous litigation over the jurisdictional boundaries of the reservation. That's what it was. It was the jurisdictional boundary. Right.
You have the water right, not the water. So how do you establish jurisdiction over water? But anyway, that struck out, I think. Secondly, was kind of interested in those compacts. Because first of all, I know that Lower Colorado River tribes, they were involved in Arizona versus California litigation. They quantified their water rights in that litigation, just like I guess up here in the Yellowstone basin. So for example, you get the Chimowavies, right? You have 10,320 acre feet of quantified water rights. If they can't use it, it'd be very little. And then the government says, well, it's excess not being used. They didn't provide them with irrigation, money for irrigation. So the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California just takes that water for free, for blessings of the government, and just gives it to all the communities without paying for it since 1964. They're still doing it. So it doesn't do you any good to be part of a compact if you can't use your water anyway. But,
May I respond?
Yeah.
So one development that you might find interesting that's happened over the past couple of years is that the Arizona versus California tribe with the largest reserved right along the lower Colorado River, the Colorado River Indian tribes, also the tribe with the oldest, the most senior priority date, secured congressional permission through statutory law to lease portions of their unused water right from the Arizona versus California decree, so as to facilitate off-reservation marketing and create a revenue stream for tribal economic development. Furthermore, this past November 2025, the Crit Tribal Council recognized the legal personhood of the lower Colorado River for the first time in the Colorado River Basin. What that ends up looking like on the ground is still TBD, but one inspiring thing to connect it back to this gentleman's question is that it's possible that all parties that wish to enter into a lease with the Colorado River Indian tribes for their unused Arizona versus California decreed right might have to deal with the implications of that personhood recognition insofar as the tribe is going to be the one conferring the lease and setting the terms of the lease. I thought you might find that interesting in relation to the Colorado River.
The Colorado River tribe, did the people studies and they had an actual lease, and ready, they signed it, and Secretary Babbitt didn't sign it. It was good, just sitting there. So they won't let them lease the land without federal approval. So that's all that. So they're taking all that water for free. And secondly, the compacts. Talking about the tribes are not part of federalism, so they're not states. So we call it an interstate compact. They're looking at probably just states, a compact between states. So the tribe has to find a way to become involved with that. It has to be through the trust relationship. It seems in a way with the federal government. I don't know if they have standing. Just say, hey, we're entitled to this.
May I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
Standing applies in adjudication under Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. It does not apply in the policymaking context when you're talking about compact formation, which is a process that involves a binary approval through state legislatures and the U.S. Congress of compacts. So the standing point is not applicable if you're talking about policymaking. May I finish?
I'm totally.
May I finish, please?
Go ahead.
Okay. Second, as far as the compacts being solely relevant to the states and the federal government, only state-like agreements, that's erroneous, because as you allude to, the federal government has a trustee relationship with the tribes. And if the tribes have winners' rights in a compacted basin, if you think that the federal government is okay just approving a compact that ignores tribal nations and only focuses on states and ignores tribal water rights and only cares about state prior appropriation-based rights, I would say that that is an erroneous and an erroneously narrow view of the compact clause. It needs to be conceptualized as accounting for all three sovereigns that exist under the US constitutional structure. Even though I understand what you're saying, the federalism relationship between the federal and states is different than the treaty relationship between the federal government and the United States. But that does not mean that tribal sovereigns are irrelevant in compacted basins. That is a skewed and a binary conception of federalism, respectfully.
And I would like to address your, because I have the copy of the application here that you have to submit for treatment as a state. So I probably misspoke when I said jurisdiction over the water. What it really is that there has to be verification that the water quality standards will be applied to are water resources within the boundary and the borders of the tribe's reservation. So it's the boundaries of the Indian reservation areas for which the tribe is seeking authority to administer. So there's a process to prove that the boundaries are what they are and the waters within them are the ones that are seeking to be regulated.
And I'm fully cognizant of standing doctrine, I'm dealing with it for years and years, so I just most maybe misspoke in the context of what I'm talking about. Okay, but the point I was trying to make is you go back to the Constitution and Indians not taxed. These are not part of the political community in the United States. They're not part of federalism. They don't have representation in Congress. There's an attorney general opinion on that. And so they're not part of federalism, then how do they become part of, if you have an interstate compact, they're not a state, they're not part of federalism, then how do you incorporate them into a water compact? Probably through treaties, probably, US government. But I'm looking at it from that historical context. Why do we have the Indian Civil Rights Act? Because the Indian tribe is not part of federalism. They're not part of the Bill of Rights.
I hear
So
you.
have to
I hear you.
Statutorily impose the Bill of Rights through statute.
But you agree that tribes are sovereigns, yes?
Oh, yeah.
And you agree they exist within the territorial boundaries of the United States.
Right.
Right. So there are sovereigns that coexist with states as sovereigns and the United States as sovereigns. So whether we use the legal term federalism to describe the lateral or horizontal relationship among those sovereigns, or whether we just say, yeah, we recognize all of them are sovereigns and they need to have relationships over these transboundary rivers, that's different,
The better approaches are a protective nation of the United States. And as a protective nation, the United States has to protect their rights.
One would hope.
Pardon?
One would hope the trustee would indeed do just that.
It's part of, maybe it's not, but more part of the trust relationship to become protectorate nations of the United States. So what does that imply? It implies you have to protect our interests. Right?
Thank you for your thoughtful comments and questions. I want to make sure
I haven't really delved into it like you have. And I'm just speaking from experience.
Thank you. I want to make sure we get to some other questions. Yes.
Yeah, right now with us at the Missouri River Basin, we have issues with our treaty water. But one of my visions or thinking was I could come here and meet with you guys, NARF, everyone, and we could team up together and see what all the issues and the burning issues that legally from the Colorado River and build us a strategy on the Missouri River with our tribes so that we already learned from the mistakes and we already know how to plan for the future with Missouri River water, because we have the Missouri River Master Manual. The tribes are not even on it. And we have treaty water.
Can I add a question to that we got online?
Okay.
And this question's directed at Jason, but for you all on the same subject. So Missouri River is the largest river in North America and does not have any interstate water compact, and it establishes federal government's dominance over Missouri River water management. Do you think more federal government dominance makes tribal nations in the basin more vulnerable in terms of their sovereign water rights, given the history and legal and legacy of settler colonial violence against tribal nations in the basin.
Two responses. The Yellowstone River is a tributary of the Missouri River. It's the primary tributary to the Missouri River. So there is a compact in the Missouri River Basin, although I take the point that there's not a basin-wide compact in the Missouri River Basin. As far as whether I would support federal dominance of, I guess, co-sovereign relations over Missouri River water, no way. I very much hope that transboundary relations over big rivers like the Missouri in the 21st century look much different than they did in the 20th century, since that's the period when the compacts were formed. Do I think that federal law might be involved in enshrining or formalizing some agreement between tribal nations, the Missouri River Basin states, and the federal government? Yes, I could see federal law being a tool that essentially formalizes that contract. But would I want that tool to be built in a way that it perpetuates colonization and subordination of tribal water-related values, et cetera? No way. I would want tribal nations to be where they should have been, in my view, when the compacts were first formed in the third decade, of the 20th century, and that is tribal nations having a voice in the negotiation of the interstate agreements, rather than having those interstate agreements enacted by Congress and superimposed on the tribes or given no regard to the tribes whatsoever.
Maybe either of the other panelists want to respond?
I'll just add that I think maybe that also kind of question also maybe implies that tribes may not be willing or maybe unable to, because federal dominance, what does that mean? Tribes have that representation. A lot of tribes do have people willing to come to the table and bring those values and those morals and those viewpoints with their own tribal nations to the table. And I think it's important that those voices are heard, because for a long time, we and even now at the forefront of a lot of environmental stewardship efforts are tribal people, Native nations. And so I think it's important to recognize that. Just to recognize that tribes have the capability of being more than a stakeholder, right? These are our rights we're talking about. So
Thank you.
May I add one thing to that? I will be brief. Do you think our existing interstate water compacts are going to survive climate change? Do you think they're going to stay intact as they're written right now, given the historical and projected impacts of climate change, particularly in headwaters areas like the beautiful headwaters area with an ice shot here? I guess we could disagree or agree on that. For my 2 cents, there's no way that those compacts are going to stay stationary. To think that that's the case is to think that the hydrology of the different basins is going to stay stationary. That respectfully is delusional. Climate change's impacts are impacting Western watersheds now, right? Climate change is water change, as a climatologist colleague of mine has said. So if that's the case, if climate change is going to require adapting our interstate water compacts in one form or another, maybe one aspect of that adaptation, when we bring them up to speed, when we bring them into the 21st century, should be that, yeah, sure, they stay federal documents, but guess again, who has a voice in shaping the terms of those federal documents? Tribal nations in the negotiation process, tribal water rights included into the documents themselves, tribal nation representation included into the documents themselves. That's the future 21st century West that I personally, as one dude, wants to see.
We talk about modifications of existing water issues too, like the amount of water that's coming. Like us is the Missouri River. The recharge is gonna go down. Are we gonna have to modify our water quality standards, our water availability? Are we gonna go into water conservation mode, or what's gonna happen?
Yeah, and I guess the thing I keep kind of trying to put in is like, who should have a voice at the table to express those concerns and express what you want to see, right? Your tribal nation, that tribal sovereigns should have the opportunities to exercise their sovereignty to shape those kinds of deals, in my opinion.
Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, we're trying to gather all the tribes with the 1851, 1868 treaties. Come together and then we could do a government to government water.
Okay, I have, how would climate change affect unquantified tribes with unquantified water rights? Is that means when the water, less water is available, their allocation will be less? Is it based on PO?
Yeah, I mean, the presence of unquantified, or I think as you were alluding to earlier with Chimwebe, underutilized tribal water rights is a huge problem. In my view, the federal trustee has an obligation to facilitate the processes needed to get those tribal water rights quantified and needed to turn the paper rights associated with those tribal water rights into wet water. Honor the trust relationship, honor the treaties or the treaty substitutes.
If I may pop in as the moderator, an Indigenous scholar, Dylan Headed Nicely, has done some research about climate impacts on quantified and unquantified water rights, about climate change's impacts on the PIA standard. Yeah, if you're interested, I would check out his research.
Court created doctrine. It's the court created doctrine, the PS standard. Can the court change that?
To summarize really roughly, Dylan Headed Nicely's Professor Nicely's piece. He's looking to potential amendments or clauses that are in some compacts or that should be implied into some compacts that to address climate change impacts. But I'll let you read his piece. It's a lot more comprehensive than my summary. We've got just a few more minutes, and we do still have a quick break and a keynote speaker I wanted to get to. If you all indulge me for one more minute, few more minutes, I want to exercise the moderator's prerogative. There's a question that Jason and others just were hinting at earlier related to the Colorado River Indian tribes' recent efforts and successes related to recognizing the legal personhood of the Colorado River. And as many of you know, there's a global movement led by Indigenous peoples currently taking place, seeking to recognize the rights of nature, including the rights of rivers, and then protect that, actually enforce that through the law. So I wanted to open up to the panel if any of you wanted to. Jason shared a little bit about what CRIP is up to. If I wanted to open up to the panel, see if others, I don't know, Alyson, if you wanted to share a little bit about research you might have done to this question and its applicability in the American legal system.
Right. So one of the research projects that I did while I was still in law school was that very subject, personhood of the river. And I looked at the Wanganui River and what that meant, for that Indigenous group. And it opened up a vast array of options for them. They were able to get that river cleaned up. They were able to exert a lot of their sovereignty, be more involved in a lot of their decisions, in the decisions that impact that water and how it's used. And so, I guess, what is the question?
Just explain a little bit about what you did your research on, and maybe we heard a little bit about how CRIP is going about actually kind of enforcing their view of the river.
Well, in my opinion, I think it's a great tool. There's some opinions that kind of differ on it, but my personal opinion is that it's a great tool. Referring to what Professor Robison talked about earlier and how CRIP is going to be able to, or could potentially be able to use that status to dictate the terms of their lease. That's great. I mean, that is sovereignty in action, right? And it's trickling down into everywhere else. And I think that it's a great opportunity for tribes to, because one of the things that's really important to me is, people talk about traditional ecological knowledge all the time, but what does that mean, right? That's where we can bring in our values, our true, and I can only speak as an Arapaho woman because I'm only Arapaho, but our true Arapaho values to the table, right? What does water mean to me as an Arapaho woman? And how should that apply to the water? How, and to me, I was unable to attend Wes's thing, but I know him. So I'm sure, he talked about, being able to, what does that mean for the ecology of the area? The fish in that area, how has it changed? How has the lack of water in that area, in this area, changed just the landscape, And I think that it's a great way to utilize our traditional ecological knowledge, flex it even. And so that's my opinion on it.
And I'll just add, I'm from Oregon, and so I grew up rafting on the Deschutes and the McKenzie and Rogue Rivers in Oregon. I didn't raft the Klamath, but I do know and kind of track because rivers were so important to me there when I was young. The Yurok tribe in 2019 granted legal personhood to the Klamath River. And so I think it's just, tribes using their connections to water and their tribal ecological knowledge to actually kind of put their money where their mouth is with respect to these resources. And I think it's a perspective that, as much as I love the rivers I grew up on, I have a different connection to them. But understanding how I could have a different connection is important to me. And I think it communicates to non-tribal members really the value and the meaning of those resources. And so I think it's pretty cool. And who knows what that determination had, what role it played, in the dam removal and then the restoration of the Klamath River. So
Thank you.
Well, and then, sorry, just really quick.
Please.
I have a colleague who actually just left NARF. She wrote a law review article on that very subject. Her name is Ashley Anderson, and her law review article is called Tribal Rights of Nature Laws, Fulfilling Sacred Obligations, and it explores all of that. So that's my plug for my colleague. Please look into it.
Okay. One more comment?
May I comment on
Yes,
this question?
Please.
Okay. So, thanks for your patience with me. I get really passionate about this stuff, as you can tell. Do you believe the Wind River is a relation? I'm putting that question to you. I'm flipping the script, or as it were, flipping the room. Do you believe the Wind River is a relation? Then why not recognize it as such under tribal law? If you believe that, then why don't you put that in writing in your tribal water code? Second question. If you believe the Wind River is a relation and it's worth putting it in your law, what does that mean for changes to the tribal water code? Are other things that need to be done so that that relation gets treated like a relation? It's one thing to say the river's a relation. That's powerful, right? It's another thing to think through. What's that mean for water management? And what that's going to mean for our existing water management? And how are we going to change our existing water management so that the idea that the river is a relation is not just something like words on a page in a tribal water code posted on an internet site? I would suggest humbly that those who feel that the Wind River is a relation should consider those lines of thought.
And with those thoughts,
Yeah, do you think all tribes should adopt the Hearth Act, which allows you to release tribal land for agricultural purposes without governmental approval? Seems like all tribes should adopt that with the Hearth Act. And the question is, if you can lease your land without federal approval, why can't you lease water, which is part of the land, without federal approval? Just question. Just thought of it.
if you're all comfortable, we'll leave it with that thought-provoking question. We do still have one other very important speaker joining us this afternoon. So thank you all for bearing with the extended program, for your thoughtful comments and your attention. And thank you to our panelists. Can we give them a